The area of land we know today as Yellowstone National Park was unexplored by European Americans until the late 19th century. John Coulter, a mountain man who traveled on the Lewis and Clark expedition from 1803 to 1806, is believed to be the first European American to explore the land we know today as Yellowstone. After parting with Lewis and Clark, Coulter set off to explore the region, working for the Missouri Fur Trading Company in 1807 in hopes of finding fur trading possibilities. His reports of the land, as well as many others from the time, fascinated the public. In fact, they feared people. At the time of Coulter's adventure, the general public's imagination of Yellowstone was a rough and hellish place. From the erupting geysers to bubbling hot springs and an overall rugged landscape, no one thought it was logical to ever visit. The drier landscapes of the West were so unfamiliar to these early Americans compared to the lush green countrysides they were familiar with. Yet, at the same time, this curiosity festered within people who became more and more eager of learning what was there and seeing it for themselves. There were several attempts following John Coulter to explore the region to learn more about it, but they were unsuccessful in reaching the area. It wasn't until the government-funded Washburn-Duane exploration in the summer of 1870 that the idea of preserving Yellowstone began. One of the men on the first government-funded explorations of Yellowstone, the Washburn-Duane exploration of 1870, was a man named Nathaniel Longford. Longford was the former U.S. Collector of Internal Revenue for Montana, and later would become one of the most important park bill lobbyists for the preservation of Yellowstone as a national park. Langford wrote his personal account of Yellowstone in a magazine known as the Scribner's Monthly. Illustrating Langford's article were black and white woodcuts by an artist named Thomas Moran. Thomas Moran is one of the first men credited with helping others see Yellowstone's true beauty and had a positive impact on the public's perception of Yellowstone. When Moran read Langford's work, he was persuaded to see Yellowstone for himself. In July of 1871, Moran joined an expedition in Yellowstone led by Ferdinand Hayden, an American geologist. Over several months, Moran worked on his own collection of sketches and paintings of the most beautiful sights of Yellowstone. Present-day author John Clayton wrote in reflection of Thomas, "What is most fascinating about Moran is his ambition. He was not a plein-air painter, reproducing what he saw in front of him. Rather, he would take these scenes home to construct images that interpreted Yellowstone for others. He intended to transform the nature he witnessed into art, into a piece of culture for others to consume." Moran did just that. After his paintings were able to persuade Congress and the park bill was passed, to allow others to feel less frightened of seeing the unknown features of Yellowstone, Moran painted the upper falls of the Yellowstone River similar to Niagara Falls, which was more familiar to the public. In May of 1872, Moran's work was presented in Clinton Hall in New York, a building that housed the fourth largest library in the nation, as well as the city's largest fine arts auction business. The only image on display that night was Moran's 12 by 7 foot canvas titled The Grand Canyon of Yellowstone. In the opening, Moran reported feeling as though all of New York was there. Moran's work encouraged not only the passing of the bill within Congress, but it also attracted more visitors to the park. Those who came and saw his painting were awed, and they suddenly grew interested to see Yellowstone for themselves. Moran's work was successful in that it changed the way people viewed nature as being harsh and in need of control into something more generous and beautiful. A good friend of Moran was William Henry Jackson, a photographer who was also on the Hayden expedition. Jackson's photographs were crucial to the public's understanding of the park and to the founding of Yellowstone as a national park. William Henry Jackson was a war veteran seeking to leave behind his past, so he set off from his home of Vermont to the west in search of new life. He made way to Omaha, Nebraska in 1867 and settled in working and owning a photography studio. A year later, he began working for and photographing the construction of the Union Pacific Railroad Company. Hayden found Jackson's work while he was doing business in Omaha and eventually hired Jackson as the official photographer on the Hayden expedition to Yellowstone. He moved to Washington, D.C. to be closer to Hayden and prepare for their journey to Yellowstone. When the crew arrived in Yellowstone, Jackson used a technique called the collodion process to take pictures. The process to making pictures at this time was difficult. One had to wet a glass plate negative in a dark room, or a tent used by Jackson while traveling, and coat it with chemicals such as nitric acid and silver nitrate. The plate was then carried into a light, tight holder to the camera where it was inserted. The picture was made by removing the slider protecting the glass and being exposed to the light. Afterwards, the glass was placed back in the holder and carried back into the darkroom for the final stages of development. At last, prints were made from the glass negatives. The images he took of Yellowstone were crucial to convincing Congress to create Yellowstone a national park for all to visit. They provided evidence that Moran's paintings were not fake and were, in fact, real. 21st century photographer Bradley J. Boner was so moved by Jackson's pictures he recreated the pictures of Yellowstone that Jackson took in the late 1800s and put them side by side in a book he wrote called Yellowstone National Park Through the Lens of Time.
Hi, I'm Brad Boner. For 3 summers, I worked on a personal photography project, rephotographing William Henry Jackson's pictures from the 1871 Hayden Survey to the region that would become Yellowstone National Park. In a partnership with the University Press of Colorado, this Kickstarter project aims to raise funds to publish these photographs in a fine art coffee table book to show readers that the effort to preserve special places like Yellowstone is a noble and worthwhile effort.
Jackson had the resources of the U.S. government at his disposal upon his return to Washington, D.C. after the survey. He and his assistants were able to produce a large quantity of prints in a short amount of time, and Hayden made sure that they were distributed widely and, perhaps more importantly, to the right people, notable members of Congress, who would be influential in passing the legislation for Yellowstone's preservation. Therefore, William Henry Jackson became virtually a household name, as his photographs gave America the first real glimpse into Yellowstone. Jackson's work, along with Moran's, proved to be very useful for lobbyists. Corps of Engineers Captain Hiram M. Chittenden wrote about Moran and Jackson's photographs together, saying, "They did a work which no other agency could do, and doubtless convinced everyone who saw them that the regions where such wonders existed should be preserved to the people forever." On May 1, 1872, the Yellowstone Act passed, just 7 months after the Hayden Survey had ended. Also involved in the creation of Yellowstone and its growth after its founding in 1872 were the many reports written on the park which contributed to its success. As author Lee H. Whittlesey said in his novel Ho for Wonderland, Yellowstone became the world's first national park in 1872 and remarkably achieved nationwide fame almost immediately, primarily because journalists and other writers reported on the discoveries of the 1870 Washburn Party and the 1871 Hayden Survey. At the time of its creation, the best way to share news was through newspapers and books. In this way, Yellowstone was featured in the U.S. major newspapers such as the New York Times, the Chicago Evening Journal, and the then popular magazines like Scribner's Monthly and the Overland Monthly. Following Yellowstone's creation as a national park, articles were written and picked up by the public all over the country and even across the world. American reports of the park were published in newspapers in Europe, such as the Time and Illustrated London Times. When asked himself if these accounts made Yellowstone more famous, writer Lee Whittlesey said, "Undoubtedly, even the accounts published in obscure newspapers did, especially when their authors were estimable persons of reputation. And even Yellowstone's most lowly visitors, if they left a published account, must have influenced a few or even many newspaper buyers who read their accounts. All of those and these writers spread the word so widely about Yellowstone that by 1897 the park was a grand tourist success with more than 10,000 visitors passing through its gates." One of these reports was written by U.S. Congressman from California, Henry Zenas Osborne. Osborne was also the owner and editor of the Los Angeles Evening Press. Osborne wrote the following account for his newspaper, which was published in 1888. "Looking up the river, the view is as beautiful as any that I have ever witnessed. It lacks the awful depth and grandeur of many points in Yosemite, but for charming, entrancing beauty, I do not think I have ever seen its equal in nature." These were the people who shared their story of Yellowstone and who inspired others to visit the park. Without their accounts of the wonders they saw, no one would have known such a beautiful place existed. The works of Thomas Moran and William Henry Jackson also contributed to the success and development of the park. The use of media during this time was more crucial in spreading the word and proving to the public that Yellowstone was real. 146 years later, Yellowstone has still captured the awe and attention of the growing number of visitors every year since its founding, thanks to the paintings, photographs, and written accounts of the early explorers of what became Yellowstone National Park.